Hey everyone, this is Lisa Graves with Legal AF for Court Accountability Action. And today I'm here with one of the great writers for The Atlantic magazine, David Graham. He's been writing about a lot of different issues. I'm sure many of you have read his work, but the most recent article that he wrote about the midterms coming up next year and the threat Trump poses to them, I think is really important, especially as Americans are going to the polls for this November 2025 sort of off-year election. And we are seeing some of the efforts to try to steal or rig the election in 2026 already. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Graham to Legal AF.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, David, I really appreciate so many of the articles in The Atlantic and yours in particular. I really valued the scenario that you spun out in the most recent article about Trump threatening the midterms, and also your review with a number of experts on election policy and national security and the like. I wonder if you could share with us how you're feeling now, November 2025, about the risks to having a safe, secure election in 2026. And the ability of the American people to have their voices genuinely be heard, to have their votes counted.
I'd say I'm a little rattled. I have been covering election issues for a long time. I feel like I'm in this world, and yet when I started reporting this and talking to a lot of experts, I was surprised by how bleak a lot of the scenarios they sketched were, and just how many there were. So I think there are real dangers, and I think there's ways that we can have relatively free and fair elections. I'm not hopeless, but I am very nervous.
Yeah, I mean, when I read your article about the assertion by Cleta Mitchell that supposedly that President Trump could send in troops to polling places despite federal law barring troops from being near general or special election polling places unless there's an actual, national security threat.
A rebellion.
Yeah, a rebellion. But then her assertion that they're likely to do that is really outrageous. Now, I've been following Cleta Mitchell for a number of years. She's been involved in an array of efforts to suppress the vote, to intimidate voters. She was behind basically the lawyer advising the group that calls itself True the Vote, that was sending people, from Texas into Milwaukee, into Wisconsin elections, making all sorts of claims about the fairness of Wisconsin elections. And obviously she's been involved in a number of other controversial issues, including that infamous Trump call to Georgia, trying to say that the Georgia Secretary of State, a Republican, was supposed to somehow find him, more than 10,000 votes so that he could win Georgia, despite the actual vote of Georgians. And now he's appointed her to one of these commissions that is involved in election administration. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you know about Cleta Mitchell and her claims or her agenda, or both?
I mean, I think you're right that where you see, Cleta Mitchell pops up all over the place in these things. And she has been an important figure on the right for decades now. She was a very important figure in 2020, excuse me. And, we saw, for example, Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and Jenna Ellis going out and making some of the more ridiculous claims. They got knocked down quickly. But Cleta was somebody who was a little bit more behind the scenes. And she's somebody who, even people who disagree with her think that she is a talented lawyer. And for that reason, they get nervous when she's involved. She has something now called the Election Integrity Network, which purports to be trying to keep elections safe, but really looks like a way to push into elections. And this is exactly right. She said recently, she said, there are ways that the president can interfere in elections, even though she acknowledges there's not really power, but under emergency powers, he could get involved if there was a threat to national sovereignty. And so I was, trying to push her on what that meant. And she, I think her argument is that if states aren't doing what the president says, that is a danger to national sovereignty, which is certainly not the sense in which I think the law is written.
Right.
But you can see how that creates a door then for suddenly the president to start asserting powers he doesn't have. And if there's something that has been consistent in these first few months of the second Trump administration, it is Trump trying to claim powers that he doesn't have and waiting to see if anybody will stop him.
Well, that's right. And, this so-called Election Integrity Network, EIN, that CLETA has pushed. That was the group that was actively involved through a number of parts of its network in trying to stop the seating of the elected Supreme Court justice in North Carolina. I know you're a Duke alum and have followed what's happened in North Carolina quite a bit, but that was really outrageous. The justice won that election. Her opponent challenged that election. There were all these efforts to basically stop votes from being counted, including votes from members of the military voting overseas. It was just an outrageous act in defiance of the will of the people of North Carolina. But it was the CLETA EIN effort and its allies in the state that were behind the effort to literally stop Americans' votes from being counted. Ultimately, nearly 6 months after that election, her opponent, not CLETA's opponent, the woman who won's opponent, finally conceded after a judicial ruling against him. But that took months, and the mischief that someone like CLETA Mitchell can cause to the outcomes of our elections is just enormous. But obviously, it's not just CLETA Mitchell. She's a central figure and someone who had some consequences from that action in Georgia in terms of her law firm. She had been long involved in the Bradley Foundation, one of the big, huge right-wing foundations that has been fueling a lot of these efforts to make it harder for Americans to vote. But she's not the only one. Can you tell us about some of the other figures that you're watching or that you've been reporting on who are part of this effort, in my view, my personal opinion, to subvert the results of the American voter, to basically deny us truly representative government?
So I would just say first, I'm so glad you brought up that North Carolina Supreme Court race. And I think, the question of military involvement or armed law enforcement getting involved in elections is really important. If you set that aside, I think North Carolina shows a lot of the ways these can happen. It's a state where we've seen concerted efforts at gerrymandering, at vote suppression over a period of many years. Successful attempts to take over the Board of Elections, put it in the hands of Republican sort of political operators. And then we saw in this election attempt, as you say, the election was clear. The votes were counted. There were multiple recounts. It was very clear that Allison Riggs, the incumbent, had won. And yet they were able to drag this on. And state courts nearly sanctioned it. It was only when a federal court weighed in that stopped. And I think that kind of effort from from way out, where you're changing the rules, you're changing the context for the election, moving up to after the election and trying to get rid of votes, is a good template for what we need to be worried about in 2026 and in future elections. So yeah.
So that's so I really appreciate you giving the context and Justice Riggs's re-election and how important that was, and that's a case where the court that Supreme Court in North Carolina is Republican dominated. They just didn't want another Democrat on that panel, in part because there are other elections coming up in these next 2 or 3 years, that if the voters in North Carolina vote for Democratic judicial nominees, Democratic judicial candidates for the Supreme Court, that could change the direction of the state, because we already know what happened when big dark money came in and helped capture that North Carolina Supreme Court. That Supreme Court previously had held that these efforts by the Republican legislature to create these really distorted maps to make it harder for North Carolinians to vote had a particular impact on diluting the black vote in North Carolina. And then as soon as the Republicans got the majority, they just reversed that opinion, not because that opinion was wrong, but because they had the votes to do so.
Right, exactly. And it was something that court watchers here said was unprecedented. And I think that Republicans have grasped how effective these courts can be, especially, in this era when the Supreme Court has washed its hands of a lot of these things, said that partisan gerrymandering isn't something it can take care of, and said states have the responsibility. We see these, big conservative networks working to capture state Supreme Courts and to put them in the hands of people who will rule for them. And in this case, we saw the Republican majority on the state Supreme Court potentially ruling on who would join them, whether they would kick a Democrat out of their ranks and put a Republican in there. Coming up from he was on a lower court. Again, these courts were hearing issues related to this guy. In some cases, we had judges who had given to him, donated to his campaign, hearing cases. So it's really a troubling situation full of conflicts of interest.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, North Carolina really has been an experiment, a ground for experimentation by people trying to rig the election at all, basically all levels and for all key offices. It's just extraordinary. And now, of course, we're seeing North Carolina Republicans respond to Trump's demands that the maps be redrawn again in order to try to protect him from the will of the American people in the midterms coming up. And one of my big concerns is that this U.S. Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, is poised to strike down the really remaining enforcement provision in the Voting Rights Act. I write about this in my new book, Without Precedent, about how John Roberts, basically began his career by attacking efforts to protect the Voting Rights Act Section 2. That's because his mentor joined in an opinion to make it harder to prove, Section 2 violations by, basically saying you had to show racial or racist intent. You couldn't just show the effect, the dilution effect, basically, of a particular map or provision or activity by the state. And so just last year, we saw this Roberts Court in the South Carolina case, that gerrymandering to try to actually bleach out the first district of South Carolina. That's Nancy Mace's district right now, to try to and to actually move Black voters out of the district that they and their family, their fathers, mothers, grandmothers had voted in for years. And the Roberts Court said, oh, wait, we're not even actually going to consider this to be racial gerrymandering as long as there's a partisan purpose. It's okay, even though the lower court in that case, as I'm sure you know, a three-judge panel found that the race was specifically considered by the South Carolina legislature in drawing that map, and found that to be a racial gerrymander. And now that is what has precipitated, that ruling, along with others, has precipitated these unusual mid-decade map redrawing, as we're seeing in Texas and more. And obviously, we're also seeing this week an effort within California to try to counter that effort to rig the vote. But I'm worried that the U.S. Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, the partisans on the nation's highest court are going to put their fist on the scale of justice to try to help Trump keep Mike Johnson in the speaker's seat in the House of Representatives. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think we know that we know that there's a real chance of this being close. If the Trump administration did not believe that this election was going to be close and that they were in a tough spot in 2026, we would not see them trying to squeeze a couple districts here and there, in Texas, in Indiana, in North Carolina, in all of these states. And I think that's a recognition that that they're struggling with voters. And so they're trying to change the rules of the election ahead of time. And that's, that is what I don't think voters like the idea of elected officers choosing them instead of the other way around, but that's exactly what we seem to be having.
Well, one of the really sort of interesting points in your article, and there were many, but one that I think few people recognize is I think you wrote that 18 of the congressional districts in this very closely divided House were decided by 10,000 votes or fewer, so fewer than 10,000 votes. And so that's where manipulation, suppression, intimidation, could play a role. And then obviously if the maps are redrawn, then I guess they don't have to worry so much about how American people vote, because they can pack and crack in terms of like packing in Democrats and moving out Republicans, basically to expand the Republican majority. But I already, in my estimation, based on the Supreme Court's decision in the Alabama case back in 2022, where the Supreme Court said, as of February 7th, 2022, it was too late to redraw the maps in Alabama, even though they were found by the lower court to be in violation of the Voting Rights Act. That decision, and the fact that then other states could have similarly violated, maps that violate the Voting Rights Act go forward. That's what gave the Republicans the majority in the midterms during the Biden administration. That's what ultimately swept Mike Johnson to power. And here we have now this Congress that is, on the House side, not sitting, refusing to come back into session to swear in elected Representative Grijalva, refusing to basically allow a vote on the release of the Epstein files, refusing to negotiate in any fair way with Democrats about the shutdown of the American government. We're seeing people, losing their access to food benefits, including kids born in poverty who will not have access to those SNAP benefits and more. So much is at stake. Our rights are at stake. Kitchen table issues are at stake. What's your view in terms of what brings you hope in the midst of all this? Are there things that you're seeing that are causes for hope, or things that people can build upon to try to counter this ongoing effort from, in my view, from the executive branch, from the legislative branch, from the judicial branch, basically to undermine representative government in America?
I think there's a few things. One of them is paying attention and being ready for these things. It's a lot harder to steal an election out from people under people's noses. And we saw the kind of outrage in 2020 when Trump was trying to do this. When people realized what was going on, they were very upset about it. So I think that's important. I think another thing is I mean, this seems so obvious, but it is the bedrock, is getting out to vote, not letting, all of these things, in a lot of cases, no one thing is going to stop you from voting. We talk about these and they're little, and it can sound like they're minor. But as Mark Elias, the Democratic election lawyer, told me, elections are won on the margins. These things really add up. So you got to make sure you vote. You make sure you vote early. Make sure you get your ballot. If you're voting by mail, make sure you're getting it in time so that it gets postmarked in time to be counted, for example. The other thing that gives me hope is just the kinds of, our election system is so diffuse. And we see here Trump trying to take control of the system in a way that the law does not allow. He has no statutory role in elections, and yet he's trying to do this. So much of this comes down to the diffusion of our election system. And there are places in this country where election deniers have reached office. I think we need to be really worried about that. But there are also so many places where there are people who just really care about elections and care about professionalism and want all the votes to be counted and are not partisans. And those are the people who I think run a lot of our elections. And so seeing those people, talking to those people gives me hope, because I think they care a lot, and I think they're preparing. I think they are going into this aware of a lot of the challenges, and they're getting ready. They're making their plans to ensure that they can make sure the votes get counted fairly.
Yeah, that is such a sign of hope. There are so many good Americans, good people in our country who are devoted to our democracy, who are devoted to fair rules, who aren't trying to rig the votes. I really think it is a small minority, and you can see it in some ways in the polling for this president. How little support he has from the American people. He certainly doesn't have a majority of support, and not for basically staying in power forever, even though, one of his websites is selling 2028 hats outlandishly. One of the things I was going to say, maybe we could close on, is I think there is a real opportunity for Americans to come together around the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and reaffirm our support for representative government, which is not a monarchy, which is not an autocracy or an authoritarian regime, but where our votes count. Where our voices matter. And so I wonder if you could just maybe close us out here, David, with some thoughts on that 250th anniversary coming up this next year.
I think that's a great way of framing it. It's a good reminder of what this country is about. It's a good reminder of the importance of having a fair and democratic system above, any policy consideration. We can disagree about policy, but if we don't have, a representative democratic government with free and fair elections, it means that none of those things are safe. And I think seeing No Kings protests this year has been a reminder of that. I mean, it touches right back to the heart of the Declaration of Independence. That we don't have a king. And it's something that seems to be uniting people who are, there are people who may be more conservative, people who may be more liberal, but what they're coming together on is the idea that they object to a president acting without checks on his authority, acting lawlessly, disregarding courts, disregarding Congress. And I see people tuning into that, and I see a groundswell of concern for this. And, I'd say we were told after the 2024 election by some people that this meant that Americans don't care about democracy, that those things don't resonate with people. And I think what we see is it does. I think democracy is really important to people. We've seen that time and again. And I think we're going to see that again in 2026 and in 2028.
Yeah. Well, gosh, thank you so much, David, for coming out. I hope you'll come back again. Folks, please do check out David's article in The Atlantic. Also, please do subscribe, like, share our Midas Touch Network here. It's Lisa Graves with Court Accountability Action. I've been speaking just now with David Graham from The Atlantic. Thank you all for joining us.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.